In a blind date, she pointed to his necklace and said, "That woman is just like my adopted daughter." What happened next changed their lives forever, a story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and comment on where you are watching from. The light March rain tapped against the windows of Cozy Bistro, a quaint restaurant in the heart of Brooklyn. Helen Anderson adjusted her slightly wavy brown hair as she watched the activity on the street through the fogged glass. At 50, she maintained the elegant posture she had cultivated over decades as a clinical psychologist, but her fingers nervously drummed on the rustic wooden table. The blind date organized by Mariana, her co-worker, seemed more and more like a bad idea. "He's perfect for you, Helen," echoed her friend's words in her mind. "Matthew is a serious, hard-working man, and he's been single for a long time." Helen sighed, taking a sip of the white wine she had ordered to calm her nerves. At 50, she had built a carefully structured life. Her clinic in the Upper East Side was successful, her apartment in Midtown was organized and quiet, and her routine was predictable, exactly how she liked it. Romantic relationships had not been part of this picture for almost a decade, since the divorce that had made her more cautious about matters of the heart. The restaurant had a rustic charm that Helen would normally appreciate: reclaimed wood tables, hanging plants from the ceiling, and a warm yellow light creating an intimate atmosphere. The aroma of rosemary and fresh basil wafted from the open kitchen, mingling with the soft sound of a guitar in the background. Under different circumstances, she would feel perfectly relaxed there. "Helen?" A deep, male voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up and felt her heart race. Not because of the tall, dark-haired man standing in front of her, although he was clearly attractive, with graying hair at the temples and kind brown eyes. What took her breath away was what hung from a gold chain around his neck, partially visible through the neckline of his navy polo shirt. A golden butterfly, small, delicate, with its wings slightly open. Identical to the pendant she had given to Charlotte 15 years ago. "Are you okay?" Matthew Smith observed the woman in front of him with concern. He was a civil engineer, accustomed to reading blueprints and structures, but the expression on Helen's face was a mystery that left him unsettled. Yes, sorry." Helen forced a smile, extending her trembling hand. "Helen Anderson. It's a pleasure to meet you." Matthew's hand was rough, the kind of hands that come from working with one's own labor, despite being a professional. At 45, he maintained a neat appearance without being overly polished. A well-groomed beard, always styled hair, clean nails. He was a man who drew attention for the serenity he exuded, not for ostentation. "The pleasure is mine. Mariana told me a lot about you." He sat down in the opposite chair, noticing how Helen seemed to struggle to divert her gaze from his chest. "Is something wrong?" Helen took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She was a psychologist, for God's sake. She knew how to control her emotional reactions better than anyone. But seeing that specific necklace on a stranger's neck was stirring up psychological structures she had carefully built to protect her deepest wounds. No, it's nothing. It's just, your necklace is very beautiful. Where did you get it?" Matthew instinctively brought his hand to his chest, touching the pendant with obvious tenderness. "It was a gift from my daughter. Charlotte gave it to me a few years ago, before she moved to Portugal." The name hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. Charlotte, her Charlotte. The girl with green eyes and a mischievous smile whom she had adopted at 7 years old from St. Francis' home in Cambusi. The same child who had become a bright and determined teenager, dreaming of exploring the world and working with languages. "Charlotte," Helen murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. "What a beautiful name. Has she lived in Portugal for a long time?" "About 5 years. She got a job as a translator in Lisbon right after graduating in languages." Matthew smiled with evident paternal pride. "She's a girl. Well, a woman now, very determined, always knew exactly what she wanted. Helen nodded slowly, fighting against the tears that threatened to escape. Determined, yes. Charlotte had always been that way. Determined enough to, at 18, refuse Helen's request for her to stay with her during college. Determined enough to insist she needed independence, that it was time to build her own life. "Do you have children, Helen?" The question hit like a knife. Helen swallowed hard, her hands involuntarily clenching under the table. I have an adopted daughter, but we grew apart a few years ago." "I'm sorry." Matthew leaned slightly forward, his voice filled with genuine empathy. "I know how difficult it is when children drift away. Charlotte and I went through some tough times too, especially when she decided to move to Europe." The waiter approached, a slender young man in his 20s, wearing a black apron and a professional smile. "Good evening. Have you decided what you would like?" Helen hadn't even looked at the menu. Could you give us a few more minutes?" "Of course, no problem." When they were alone again, Matthew observed Helen with growing attention. There was something in her reaction that he couldn't decipher, an emotional intensity disproportionate to a casual conversation between strangers. "Helen, are you sure everything is okay? You seem disturbed." She finally managed to look him directly in the eye. Matthew had the gentle face of someone who had been through hardships, but still had the capacity to care for others. Fine lines around his eyes revealed both worries and smiles. He was the kind of man one could trust, but how to trust? He asked if his daughter, the most important person in his life, was also the most important person in her life. "It's just that sometimes life throws us strange curveballs, don't you think?" Helen tried a more convincing smile. "Coincidences that make us think about fate." "Do you believe in fate?" "I never did. I'm too rational for that, but—" She looked back at the necklace. "Maybe I'm rethinking some things." Matthew chuckled softly, a deep and pleasant sound that echoed through the restaurant. "My daughter always says that the universe has mysterious ways of putting people in the right place at the right time. I used to mock that philosophy of hers, but lately, I have the impression that she was right about many things." Helen felt a pang in her chest. Charlotte had always been a wise girl beyond her years, full of theories about life and love that Helen considered youthful naivety. Hearing Matthew speak of her that way, with affection, respect, and admiration, stirred a confusing mix of relief and jealousy. The rain had stopped, and the lights of Brooklyn began to shine more brightly through the windows. The cozy bistro was getting busier, with couples and groups of friends filling the tables around. But Helen felt as if she were in a bubble, isolated from the real world by a discovery that would change everything. "Tell me more about Charlotte," she asked, trying to sound casual. "How did you two meet?" Matthew slowly swirled the glass of red wine between his fingers, watching the dark liquid reflect the warm lights of the restaurant. There was something in Helen's question about Charlotte that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the intensity in her eyes, or the way her hands trembled almost imperceptibly when she mentioned her adopted daughter. "Charlotte," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I met her when she was 18. It was a complicated situation. She was living with a family that, well, let's just say it wasn't going very well." Helen felt her heart race. 18 years old, exactly the age Charlotte was when she decided to leave home, claiming she needed independence to grow. At the time, Helen had interpreted it as typical late adolescent rebellion, but now she began to suspect there was more behind that decision. "What kind of family?" Helen tried to keep her voice neutral, but her nails dug into her palms under the table. "A family," How can I put this? Very controlling. Matthew hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. Charlotte never likes to talk much about it, but from what I understood, it was an older woman, a psychologist, who had very high expectations. Charlotte felt suffocated. The words hit Helen like a slap. Controlling, high expectations, suffocated. Was that how her daughter felt? All these years, Helen had believed she was providing structure and security for a girl who had spent her early years in an orphanage. She never imagined that Charlotte interpreted her care as imprisonment. And how did you become close? Helen's voice came out rougher than she intended. Matthew smiled, and for the first time since he sat at the table, his expression softened completely. She showed up at the construction site where I was working. It was a social housing project in East New York. Charlotte had gotten an internship at the City Hall, something related to documenting the families that would benefit. Helen vaguely remembered Charlotte mentioning an internship at City Hall during her last year of school. At the time, she had questioned whether it would interfere with her studies for college entrance exams, suggesting that the girl focus more on her books, another demonstration of control that Charlotte had probably held onto as resentment. She arrived at the site wearing a grey blazer and dress shoes, trying to look professional, but she was clearly out of place. Matthew chuckled softly at the memory. The workers stared at her as if she were an alien, but Charlotte, she had this ability to adapt to any environment. Did? Helen noticed the verb tense and felt a tightness in her chest. Does. Sorry, it's just that sometimes I feel like she is two different people. The Charlotte I met here in the US, determined but a bit lost, and the Charlotte who lives in Portugal now, completely self-assured. Helen bit her lower lip, an old habit that resurfaced in moments of anxiety. She remembered perfectly the lost Charlotte that Matthew described, a bright young woman but insecure about her place in the world, oscillating between gratitude for the adoption and the desperate need to prove she could be independent. The waiter returned, and this time they managed to place their orders. Helen chose a mushroom risotto, more for being something that wouldn't require much appetite than for a real desire to eat. Matthew opted for grilled salmon, asking for it to be well done. A careful man, Helen noted, even in the small things. "And you?" Matthew asked when they were alone again. "Tell me about your daughter. Why did you drift apart?" Helen took a deep breath, preparing for the edited version of the truth she had rehearsed mentally. She also wanted independence. "I may have been too protective. When you spend so much time caring for someone, you sometimes forget that the person needs to fly with their own wings." "I completely understand." Matthew nodded with genuine empathy. "When Charlotte told me she wanted to move to Europe, my first reaction was to try to dissuade her. I listed all the dangers, all the difficulties she would face alone in a foreign country." "And how did she react?" "She looked at me with those green eyes of hers and said, 'Matthew, if you really love me, you'll let me go.'" He unconsciously fiddled with the necklace. That was the most mature thing I've ever heard from someone 23 years old. Green eyes. Helen closed her eyes for a second, recalling the same determined expression Charlotte had made 15 years earlier when she declared she wouldn't stay for college. The same phrase, "Adapta sois, Carolina, Charlotte, Parque do Ibirapuera, Central Park, Liberdade, Chinatown." Practically, it had broken Helen's heart in two. "It must have been very difficult for you," murmured Helen, genuinely sympathetic to the pain that Matthew was trying to hide. It was, but she was right. And the most interesting thing is that our relationship improved a lot after she moved away. The video calls, the messages. It's as if the physical distance created an emotional closeness that we never had when she lived here. Helen felt a pang of envy, mixed with regret. There were no video calls with Charlotte. There were no messages. Just a deafening silence that lasted 15 years, punctuated only by sporadic information that Helen managed to obtain through mutual acquaintances. "Do you talk often?" "Every week. Sometimes more." Matthew smiled. "She tells me about work, the places she visits, the friends she makes, and I tell her about the projects I'm working on, the changes here in New York. Does she keep in touch with other people here in the U.S.? Matthew hesitated, and Helen realized she had touched on sensitive ground. Not many. Charlotte has always been somewhat reserved about her past. As far as I know, she completely cut ties with her adoptive family. She said it was a painful decision, but necessary for her to move on. The words fell like lead in Helen's stomach. Completely cut ties. Painful but necessary decision. All these years, she had consoled herself thinking that maybe Charlotte just needed time, that one day the girl would reach out. Discovering that the decision had been deliberate and final was devastating. Sometimes, Matthew continued, oblivious to the emotional turmoil his words caused in Helen, I get the impression that Charlotte is running away from something. Not something dangerous, but something emotional, as if she left a part of herself here in the U.S. Helen swallowed hard. What kind of thing? I don't know exactly. She changes the subject when I ask about her. Her childhood or her adoptive family. She only told me once that some doors are better left closed. The phrase echoed in Helen's mind like a painful echo. How many times had she herself repeated those words to justify her decision not to seek out Charlotte? How many nights had she stayed awake, wondering if she should break the silence, only to decide that maybe it was better to leave the past where it was? The dishes arrived, and they ate in relative silence for a few minutes. Helen could barely taste the mushroom risotto, her mind working frantically to process the information Matthew had shared. Charlotte had created a completely different narrative about her childhood. Instead of the orphan adopted by a single psychologist, she had become what exactly? Matthew, Helen finally said, putting her fork down. Forgive my curiosity, but did Charlotte ever talk about what it was like before you met? About her biological family? About how she ended up with the adoptive family? Matthew chewed thoughtfully before responding. She told me that her parents died in an accident when she was little, and that she was raised by a distant aunt who never really wanted her. According to Charlotte, this aunt saw her more as an obligation than as family. Helen felt the world spin. Charlotte had invented a completely new story about her origin. There was no aunt. There was no accident. There was only a single mother who died of an overdose when Charlotte was 5, and a father who was never identified. Helen knew every detail of the adoption process, every document, every psychological report. Why had Charlotte lied to Matthew about this? 3 weeks passed since the dinner at the Cozy Bistro, and Helen couldn't get Matthew, or more specifically, the revelations about Charlotte, out of her mind. They had scheduled a second meeting, this time for a walk in Central Park on a fall afternoon. Helen arrived promptly at 3 in the afternoon at the entrance on Fifth Avenue, wearing dark jeans and a beige knit top that accentuated her brown eyes. Matthew was already waiting, leaning against one of the wrought iron fences surrounding the park. He wore a military green polo shirt and sneakers, and Helen noticed that the golden butterfly necklace sparkled discreetly against the fabric. Every time she saw that pendant, it felt like an invisible hand squeezed her heart. I thought you weren't coming, he said, smiling as he saw her approach. Why did you think that? Helen returned the smile, although she felt the muscles in her face tense. You got a bit strange at the end of our last meeting. I thought maybe I had talked too much about Charlotte. Helen felt her stomach churn. Matthew was more perceptive than she had imagined. No, it wasn't that. It's just that sometimes it's hard to hear about healthy family relationships when our own didn't work out. They began to walk down the main path, where the trees formed a natural cathedral above their heads. The autumn leaves created a golden and red carpet under their feet, producing a soft sound with each step. The park was busy for a Tuesday afternoon, people jogging, families with small children, elderly people playing chess on the concrete benches. "Tell me more about your family," Helen asked, trying to sound casual. "Did you always raise Charlotte on your own?" Matthew hesitated, kicking a dry leaf off the path. "Not exactly. When I met her, she was in a very vulnerable situation. She had left her adoptive family's home and was living in a small rented room in Chinatown. She worked part-time at a diner to pay the rent and studied at night." "Wow, that's tough for an 18-year-old girl." "It was, but Charlotte has always had an impressive inner strength. I never saw her complain or play the victim, even when things were really complicated." Matthew stopped to watch a group practicing Tai Chi near the lake. "I think that's what touched me about her from the beginning, that ability to move forward, even carrying scars." Helen swallowed hard. Scars. How many? What scars had she unknowingly caused in Charlotte? For years, she believed she was providing the girl with everything she needed: a comfortable home in Midtown, private school, therapy when necessary, opportunities that many orphaned children would never have. She never imagined that Charlotte interpreted all this care as suffocation. "How did you all become family?" The question came out more emotionally charged than Helen intended. Matthew looked at her with curiosity. "That's a very specific question. Why?" Helen felt her heart race. She needed to be more careful. "Sorry, it's just that, as a psychologist, I've always been interested in the processes of forming alternative family bonds, adoption, blended families, that kind of thing." "Ah, I see." Matthew seemed to accept the explanation. "Well, at first we were just friends, I would say. Charlotte would show up at the construction site to do interviews with families, and we always ended up talking. She had a genuine curiosity about engineering, asking smart questions about the construction. They sat on a bench near the plant nursery, where the scent of damp earth and flowers mixed with the distant sound of city traffic. Helen watched a typical American family pass by, a father, mother, and two small children, all dressed for Sunday, even though it was Tuesday. The mother pushed a stroller while the father carried a 5-year-old girl on his shoulders. "One day," Matthew continued, "Charlotte didn't show up for the interviews. I got worried because she was always very punctual. I found out she had fallen ill, but she was alone in that tiny room, with no one to take care of her." "What did you do?" "I brought homemade soup and medicine. I ended up staying to take care of her over the weekend." Matthew smiled at the memory. She was so surprised that someone cared. It was as if she had never experienced that kind of care before. Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. During the 10 years that Charlotte lived with her, whenever the girl got sick, Helen provided the best doctors, the most effective medications, school excuses, but perhaps what was missing was exactly that: the simplicity of homemade soup made with love, the comforting presence of someone who stays just because they care. "Charlotte must have been very grateful," Helen murmured, "grateful and suspicious at the same time. I think she wasn't used to kindness without ulterior motives." Matthew fiddled with his necklace unconsciously. "It took months for her to fully accept that I really cared for her, as if she were my daughter." "And when did that happen? When did you both know you were a real family?" Matthew fell silent for a few minutes, watching an elderly couple feed ducks at the lake. Finally, he took his phone out of his pocket and began scrolling through his photo gallery. It was Christmas 2010. Charlotte had just graduated from high school and was applying for college. I had suggested she Spend the holidays at my house since she didn't have a family of her own. Helen felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Christmas 2010. Exactly the first Christmas after Charlotte left her home. While Helen spent the holidays alone, drinking too much wine and wondering where her daughter was, Charlotte was building a new family with Matthew. "Look," Matthew said, turning his phone to show a picture. This was the moment. Helen looked at the screen and nearly crumbled. It was Charlotte, without a doubt, younger, with longer hair, but unmistakably the same girl she had raised. In the photo, Charlotte was beaming next to Matthew in front of a modest Christmas tree. She wore a red dress that Helen recognized immediately. She had bought that dress for Charlotte at the Mall of America a few years earlier. But what truly devastated her was the expression on Charlotte's face. It was genuine, uncomplicated happiness, like Helen hadn't seen since the girl was very small. A joy that seemed to have been absent during the last years they spent together. "She looks very happy," she managed to say, struggling to keep her voice steady. She was, and she still is, from what I see in our video calls, but Matthew hesitated, putting his phone away. "Sometimes I feel like Charlotte carries a deep sadness that she can't, or doesn't want to, share with me." "What kind of sadness?" "I'm not sure. She never talks about it directly, but sometimes, especially when she misses America, she gets that distant look, like she's thinking of someone or something she left behind." Helen closed her eyes, feeling a physical pain in her chest. All these years, she had wondered if Charlotte missed her, if she sometimes thought about the woman who had raised her with so much love, even if imperfectly. Discovering through Matthew that yes, Charlotte carried a sadness related to her past was both comforting and devastating. "Do you think she might be thinking about her adoptive family?" Helen forced herself to ask. "Maybe, but she always changes the subject when I try to bring it up. The only thing she told me was that the woman who raised her tried to give too much love, but in the wrong way." The words hit Helen like a bullseye. Too much love in the wrong way. It was a painfully accurate description of how she had tried to be a mother to Charlotte, smothering the girl with excessive worry, setting rules that were too strict, trying to protect her from a world that Charlotte needed to experience to grow. "Matthew," Helen said, choosing her words carefully, "have you ever thought about, I don't know, trying to find out more about her past, to help her resolve those issues?" He looked at her in surprise. "I've suggested therapy a few times, but she always refuses. She says she prefers to look forward, not back. And I respect that. If Charlotte wants to share more about her past, she'll do it in her own time." Helen nodded, admiring Matthew's wisdom and patience, but also frustrated with her own impatience. She desperately wanted to know more about Charlotte. As the sun began to set, painting the sky of Brooklyn with shades of pink and orange, she reflected on how she was doing and whether she still thought about the adoptive mother she had left behind. The park was becoming emptier, with only a few evening joggers and couples dating on the benches scattered along the pathway. "Helen," Matthew suddenly said, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Why do I have the impression that you know Charlotte?" The question hit like a bolt from the blue. Helen felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "Your reactions when I talk about her, the specific questions you ask, the way you get emotional. It's like you know exactly who I'm talking about." Helen took a deep breath, realizing that she had reached the moment of truth or definitive lie. She looked into Matthew's honest eyes and knew she wouldn't be able to deceive him for much longer. "Matthew, there's something I need to tell you," she began, feeling her hands tremble. "About Charlotte, about me, about all of us." The silence that followed Helen's words was deafening. Matthew watched her with a mix of confusion and apprehension as the gentle autumn breeze moved the dry leaves around the bench where they were sitting. The park lights began to turn on, creating small islands of brightness in the growing darkness. "What do you mean by about all of us?" Matthew's voice came out low, laden with a tension Helen had never heard before. Helen felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff. Once she spoke the truth, there would be no turning back. Everything would change. Her relationship with Matthew, her chances of reconnecting with Charlotte, the entire emotional structure she had built over the last 15 years. "The Charlotte you know," Helen began, struggling to find the right words. "The girl you consider your daughter. She is my adopted daughter, the same one I lost 15 years ago." Matthew stood completely still for several seconds. Helen could almost hear the sound of his thoughts reorganizing, connecting dots that had previously seemed random. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "That's impossible. I know it sounds impossible, but no." Matthew abruptly stood up, starting to pace back and forth in front of the bench. "This can't be happening. Charlotte told me that her adoptive family was, that you were controlling, stifling, an older woman with expectations that were too high." Helen completed with a deep sadness in her voice. "She was right, Matthew. I was all those things." Matthew stopped pacing and turned to face her. His brown eyes, which Helen had found so kind during their conversations, now shone with an almost aggressive intensity. "You're telling me that for 3 weeks you let me talk about Charlotte, knowing she was your daughter, that you deliberately deceived me?" "It wasn't like that. How was it then?" Matthew's voice rose an octave, drawing the attention of a couple passing nearby. He noticed and forced himself to speak more quietly. "How was it, Helen? Because from my perspective, you've been lying to me since the first minute." Helen felt warm tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how to tell you. When I saw the necklace on the first day, when you said her name, I was in shock. And then, the more you talked about Charlotte, the more I realized that what? That she had built a better life without me." The confession came out like a sob. That she was happier away from me than she ever was when we lived together. Matthew sat back down on the bench, but this time he kept a clear physical distance between them. He brought his hands to his face, rubbing his temples as if trying to organize his thoughts. "Let me get this straight," he said, not looking. At Helen. "You are the woman Charlotte considers the greatest source of emotional pain in her life, the person she ran away from to be happy. And you are dating me." "Matthew, I didn't plan this. It was a coincidence. It was a coincidence for you to agree to go out with me, but it wasn't a coincidence for you to keep meeting me knowing the truth." Matthew finally looked at her, and Helen saw something break in his eyes. "You were using me to get news about Charlotte." The accusation hit Helen like a physical slap, because, as painful as it was to admit, there was a grain of truth in it. Yes, she had accepted to keep seeing Matthew, partly because he was her only connection to Charlotte. But it wasn't just that. "At first, maybe," Helen admitted, forcing herself to be honest. "But Matthew, I swear I started to care about you too. What I feel for you has nothing to do with Charlotte." "How can I believe that? How can I believe anything you say now?" Matthew stood up again, clearly agitated. "Charlotte told me you distanced yourselves because you were manipulative. Now I see she was right. I'm not manipulative." Helen stood up too, her own anger beginning to surface. "I made mistakes with Charlotte, many mistakes, but I always acted out of love, and with you, I'm acting out of love too." "Love?" Matthew laughed bitterly. "Helen, you've known me for 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks you've lied about who you are." "I didn't lie about who I am. I lied about my connection to Charlotte, but everything else I've shared with you is true." Helen tried to step closer, but Matthew took a step back. "My feelings for you are real, Matthew. How can I distinguish between what is true and what is manipulation? Matthew ran his hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. You knew exactly what to say to make me trust you. You knew how to react to the stories about Charlotte because you knew her better than anyone. Helen felt as if the world were crumbling around her. She had anticipated Matthew would be upset with the revelation, but he had not imagined the depth of his disappointment. He had not anticipated how painful it would be to see the trust he had placed in her turn into suspicion. Matthew, please let me explain how everything happened. No. He shook his head, taking a few more steps away from her. I need time to process this. I need to understand what it means for Charlotte, for me, for us. Is there an us? Helen asked, clinging to any thread of hope. Matthew looked at her for a long moment, and Helen saw the internal struggle reflected in his features. There was pain there, but also something softer, confusion perhaps, or the memory of the genuine moments they had shared. I don't know, he finally said. Honestly, Helen, I don't know what is real between us anymore. What we feel for each other is real, Helen insisted. The conversations we've had, the laughter we've shared, the connection we've created, none of it was fake. But it was built on a lie. Helen had no answer for that, because he was right. Everything between them had started and developed under a fundamental omission that completely changed the context of every interaction. What are you going to do? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tears. Are you going to tell Charlotte? Matthew was silent for so long that Helen began to wonder if he had heard the question. When he finally answered, his voice was tired. I don't know. Charlotte is happy in Portugal. She's building a new life, free from the issues of the past. Do I have the right to throw all of that away just because I found out who her adoptive mother is? Mother, Helen gently corrected. Not adoptive mother. Just mother. Because that's what I tried to be for her, even if I failed. Matthew looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that could be reluctant respect. You still love her, don't you? More than my own life, Helen replied without hesitation. Charlotte she has always been the center of everything for me. When she left, a part of me died. And when I found out that she had found in you the family I couldn't be, it was devastating and comforting at the same time. Why comforting? Because it means she hasn't given up on love. It means she still believes in family, even if it's not with me. Helen wiped her tears with the back of her hand. You gave her what I couldn't give, the feeling of being accepted just as she is. Matthew fell silent again, and Helen could see that her words were having some impact. The park was now almost empty, with only a few people taking evening walks, and the distant sound of traffic from Fifth Avenue. Helen, he finally said, I need time to think about all of this, about what it means, about what to do, about us. How much time? I don't know, a few weeks maybe, or months. He looked her directly in the eyes. But I need you to understand one thing. If we decide to continue, whatever that means, it has to be for the two of us. It can't be about Charlotte. And if she finds out, if she comes back to the US and knows we're together, then we'll deal with it when it happens. Matthew began to walk away, but turned one last time. Helen? Yes? Do you really care about me? Or am I just a way for you to stay close to Charlotte? The question hung in the night air like a final challenge. Helen looked at the man she had learned to love in just 3 weeks, knowing that her answer would determine whether there was any possibility of a future between them. I care about you, she said, putting all the sincerity she could muster into her voice. More than I thought possible in such a short time. Charlotte brought me to you, but what I feel now, that's just ours." Matthew nodded slowly, as if registering her words for later analysis. "I'll reach out when I'm ready to talk," he said, and then disappeared into the darkness of the park, leaving Helen alone with the weight of the truth finally revealed. 2 weeks passed since the revelation in Central Park, and Helen felt as if she were living in a glass bubble. She could see the world around her, but she couldn't really touch it or be touched by it. Her routine continued mechanically: clinic appointments, psychological reports, administrative meetings, but everything seemed to happen in a parallel dimension, while her mind remained stuck in that afternoon in the park. It was a rainy Thursday in May, when Maria appeared in her office unannounced. Helen was finishing updating a patient's file when she heard the familiar knock on the door. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones, the code they had used since their days in psychology school. "Come in, Maria," Helen said, not looking up from her computer. Maria Johnson entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and a determined expression. At 47, she was a small, energetic woman, with curly hair always tied up in a messy bun and dark eyes that missed nothing. She was the only person in the world who knew all of Helen's secrets, including the full story about Charlotte. "You look terrible," Maria said bluntly, placing one of the cups on the table and throwing herself into the chair reserved for patients. "Thanks for the compliment," Helen murmured, finally closing her laptop and taking the coffee. The strong, familiar aroma brought a bit of comfort to her frayed nerves. "Helen, you can't keep going like this. It's been 2 weeks since you've been running on autopilot." Maria crossed her legs, assuming the posture that Helen recognized as therapist mode. "What happened with Matthew?" Helen sighed deeply, sinking into her swivel chair. Her office was a reflection of her personality, organized, welcoming, but with carefully curated personal touches. A shelf filled with psychology books, a few low-maintenance plants, and a single silver-framed photo, Charlotte at 12, smiling during a trip they took together to Aspen. "I told him the truth," said Helen, fixing her gaze on the photo. "The truth about what?" Maria frowned. "That you two are practically perfect for each other, and that you're self-sabotaging because you're afraid of being happy. The truth about Charlotte." The silence that followed was so heavy that Helen could almost feel it pressing down on her shoulders. Maria placed her cup back on the saucer with a delicate clink. "Helen, tell me you didn't do what I'm thinking. He's her adoptive father, Maria." Helen finally looked at her friend, seeing her own pain reflected in Maria's eyes. "The Charlotte he considers his daughter is my Charlotte. The necklace he wears was a gift from her." Jesus Christ! Maria stood up and began to pace the room, a feminine version of what Matthew had done in the park. "Helen, this is impossible." "That's exactly what he said." "And how did he react when you told him?" Helen closed her eyes, reliving every second of that painful conversation. "How would you expect him to react? He felt deceived, manipulated. He said he needs time to think." "How long ago did this happen?" 2 weeks. "And you haven't heard anything from him since then?" Helen shook her head, feeling familiar tears threatening to return. "Nothing. Not a message, not a call. It's like I've ceased to exist." Maria stopped pacing and sat on the edge of Helen's desk, taking her friend's hands in hers. "Listen, love, I understand why you're hurting. But you need to look at this from a broader perspective. What you just discovered is extraordinary." "Extraordinary?" Helen looked at her incredulously. "Maria, I destroyed the only chance I had at a healthy relationship because I couldn't stay away from anything that connected me to Charlotte." "No, Helen. You discovered that your daughter is okay, that she found someone who loves her and takes care of her the way she needed, that she's not lost in the world, suffering alone." Maria squeezed her hands tighter. "This isn't a tragedy, it's a miracle. Helen felt a sob escape. But she created a completely different story about the past, Maria. She erased me from her narrative. It's as if the 10 years we spent together never existed, or as if they were so important that she needed to create a fictional version to move on. Maria stood and walked to the window, watching the rain fall on Fifth Avenue. Helen, have you ever stopped to think that maybe Charlotte invented this story, not because you weren't important, but because you were too important? What do you mean? Think about it. An 18-year-old girl trying to become independent. She finds a nurturing father figure, someone she wants to impress, someone whose love and approval she craves. Maria turned to face Helen. Do you think she would talk about the successful psychologist mother who raised her with all the comforts, about how she felt suffocated by so much love? Helen had never thought of it that way. For years, she had interpreted Charlotte's silence as pure and simple rejection, but perhaps there were more complex layers to that decision. Was she ashamed of me? She was afraid of being judged, afraid that Matthew would see her as spoiled or privileged or ungrateful. Maria returned to the armchair. It's easier to talk about a distant aunt who didn't want her than about a devoted mother she chose to leave. Helen sipped the coffee, which was already cooling, while processing her friend's words. There was a logic in that interpretation she hadn't considered before. And what about Matthew? Helen asked. Even if you're right about Charlotte, it doesn't change the fact that I lied to him. You omitted information. It's different. Maria leaned forward. Helen, you were protecting your daughter's privacy and trying to understand an impossible situation. Anyone would do the same. He said he didn't know what was real between us anymore. And you, do you know? The question caught Helen off guard. She had spent 2 weeks focused on Matthew's reaction, the pain of rejection, the fear of losing both Charlotte and him. She hadn't stopped to examine her own feelings objectively. I think so, she said slowly. What I feel for him has nothing to do with Charlotte, or rather it has everything to do with her, but not in the way he thinks. Explain that? Helen stood up and walked to the window, watching people running in the rain with colorful umbrellas. New York in May was always unpredictable. It could be sunny in the morning and rain, torrentially in the afternoon. Seeing how Matthew talks about Charlotte, how he loves and respects her, it made me admire him deeply. It made me realize what kind of man he is, patient, kind, capable of loving unconditionally. Helen pressed her forehead against the cold glass. But what I fell in love with wasn't Charlotte's father. It was the man who cares for underprivileged families in East New York, who makes homemade soup for sick people, who faces life with that serenity I've never been able to have. So why not reach out to him? Because he asked for time, and because... Helen hesitated. Because I'm afraid he might be right. That I am manipulative without even realizing it. Helen Anderson. Maria stood up and walked to her, turning her by the shoulders. You are many things, controlling at times, overly protective, perfectionist, but manipulative. Never. You are the most honest person I know, even when it hurts you. Then why do I feel like, would you have cheated on him? Because you really care. Because his opinion matters to you. Maria smiled for the first time since she arrived. Helen, this isn't guilt, it's love. At that moment, the phone on the table rang. Helen looked at the caller ID and felt her heart race. It's him, she whispered. Answer it, said Maria, but Helen was frozen, staring at the ringing phone. What if he's calling to end things for good, to say he doesn't want to see me anymore? What if he's calling to say he thought about everything and wants to talk? Maria crossed her arms. Helen, you'll only know if you answer. Helen took a deep breath and picked up just before it went to voicemail. Hello? Helen? Matthew's voice sounded tired but not hostile. Do you have time to talk today? Yes, Helen replied too quickly, then forced herself to modulate her voice. Yes, I have time. There's a cafe in Brooklyn near where we met, Café de Paris. Do you know it? I'll find it. 7 o'clock tonight? Helen looked at the clock. It was 4:30, enough time to take a shower, change clothes, and have a panic attack. 7 is perfect. Helen? His voice softened. Thank you for answering. The call ended, and Helen stared at the phone for several seconds before realizing Maria was smiling. Good sign? Helen asked. A guy who calls to break up doesn't thank you for answering, Maria said, grabbing her bag. Now let's go. You have 3 hours to get ready, and I'm going to help you pick an outfit that says, I'm honest, I love myself, and you should give me a second chance. For the first time in 2 weeks, Helen smiled genuinely. Café de Paris was one of those places that seemed to have come straight from the Parisian boulevards and landed in the heart of Brooklyn. Round cast-iron tables occupied the sidewalk, covered by a striped awning, while the cozy interior displayed exposed brick walls adorned with vintage posters of French films. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked croissants created an atmosphere that would usually relax Helen. But on this Thursday at 7 in the evening, her nerves were as taut as violin strings. Helen arrived 5 minutes early, choosing a table at the back of the cafe, away from the windows and street traffic. She wore a navy silk blouse that Maria had insisted highlighted her eyes, and black dress pants that made her feel professional and confident, at least on the outside. Matthew arrived promptly, at 7, and Helen felt her heart race at the sight of him. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during their previous meetings. He wore dark jeans and a grey button-up shirt, and the butterfly necklace glimmered subtly against the fabric. Always that necklace, always Charlotte present between them. "Helen," he said, approaching the table with hesitant steps. "Matthew!" She stood up, unsure whether to greet him with a kiss on the cheek or a handshake. They ended up standing at an uncomfortable distance, with no physical contact. They sat in silence for a few moments until a young waitress with pink hair approached to take their orders. Helen ordered a cappuccino, more out of nervousness than a desire for caffeine, at 7 in the evening. Matthew chose chamomile tea, which surprised her. It seemed like a less masculine choice for someone who worked on construction sites. "Thank you for coming," he said when they were alone again. "Thank you for calling." Helen clasped her hands on the table to hide the trembling. "How are you?" Matthew laughed humorlessly. "Confused? Tired? Trying to figure out how to process all of this?" He looked her directly in the eyes for the first time since sitting down. "And you?" "The same, basically." The waitress brought their drinks, and they stirred their cups for a few seconds, each lost in their own thoughts. Helen observed Matthew's hands, large, calloused, with a small scar on the back of his right hand. Hands that worked, that built things, that had cared for Charlotte when she was sick. "Helen," Matthew finally said, "I spent the last 2 weeks trying to decide if I was angrier with you or with myself. And did you come to a conclusion?" "I did." He took a sip of his tea before continuing. "I'm angry with myself for not realizing it sooner. The signs were all there. Your reactions, your questions, the way you knew details about Charlotte that I never shared." Helen felt a pang of relief mixed with guilt. "Matthew, you had no way of knowing. I was being deliberately evasive. Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" The question she had dreaded for 2 weeks. Helen took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts that had been tormenting her. "Because I was in shock," she said. "When I saw the necklace, when you said her name, my world turned upside down. And then, When you started talking about Charlotte, about how happy she was with you." Helen paused, struggling against the emotion. "I hadn't known anything about her for 15 years, Matthew. 15 years wondering if she was okay, if she was safe, if she ever thought of me. And what did you find out? That she was more than okay, that she found the father I could never give her." Helen wiped away a tear that had escaped. "And that was both the most comforting and the most devastating thing I've ever experienced." Matthew sat in silence for a long moment, watching the movement on the street through the window. A group of young people passed by laughing loudly, probably college students enjoying Thursday night. Helen remembered when Charlotte was that age, full of plans and dreams that didn't include her adoptive mother. "Helena," said Matthew, turning his attention to her, "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Did you start seeing me just because of Charlotte?" Helena had rehearsed this answer for weeks, but still hesitated before speaking. "At first, yes, I think so. Not consciously, but—" She forced herself to continue. "When I realized you were the only connection I had to her, a part of me couldn't resist. But Matthew, that changed very quickly." "When?" "On our first dinner, when you told me how you took care of Charlotte when she was sick, how you made homemade soup and stayed with her over the weekend." Helena smiled sadly. "At that moment I realized what kind of man you were, and it had nothing to do with Charlotte. And now, what? Do you feel for me now?" Helena looked into Matthew's honest eyes and decided to risk everything on the truth. "I fell in love with you, Matthew. The way you talk about your work, the patience you have with people, the kindness you show even to strangers." She took a deep breath. "The way you were able to give Charlotte something I couldn't, the feeling of being accepted just as she is." "Helena, I know this is complicated," she quickly continued. "I know our situation is impossible in many ways, but what I feel for you is real, Matthew. And it has nothing to do with Charlotte except for the fact that seeing how you love her made me admire you even more." Matthew was silent for so long that Helena began to wonder if she had said too much. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "You know what bothers me the most about all this?" Helena shook her head. "It's that I also fell in love with you. And now I don't know if it was for you or because you are part of Charlotte." "Matthew, let me finish." He raised his hand. "During these 2 weeks, I've tried to convince myself that what I felt was just confusion or anger or I don't know what. But the truth is that I miss you. I miss our conversations. The way you laugh, how you get thoughtful when you're processing something, how you genuinely care about people you don't even know." Helena felt a wave of hope rise in her chest. "So what do we do now?" Matthew sighed deeply. "Honestly, I don't know, because there's a third element in this equation that we can't ignore. Charlotte." "Charlotte?" He fiddled with the necklace unconsciously. "Helena, imagine how she will feel when she finds out that her adoptive mother, the person she ran away from, is dating the man she considers her father." The reality of the situation hit Helena like a stone. For weeks, she had been so focused on her own feelings and Matthew's reaction that she hadn't fully considered the impact this would have on Charlotte. "Do you think she will be angry?" "I think she will feel betrayed, by me and by you." Matthew drank the rest of the tea, which must have been cold by now. "Charlotte trusts me. Helena, I'm the only family she has. If she finds out that I'm secretly dating you—" "You're not secretly dating me. You didn't even know who I was. But now I do. And if we choose to continue, we will be keeping a huge secret from her." Helena felt the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. All possibilities seemed to lead to someone's suffering. What if we told her? Over the phone? By email? Matthew shook his head. Helena, this isn't something you tell from a distance, and she won't be back in New York anytime soon. How do you know? Because she just got a promotion at the translation company. She's going to start coordinating projects for the Brazilian market. Matthew smiled sadly. Ironically, she's more connected to Brazil than ever, but physically farther away. Helena absorbed this information, feeling a mix of pride for Charlotte's professional achievement and sadness, knowing that the distance would continue. Matthew, she said after a long silence, what do you want to do? He looked her in the eyes, and Helena saw the same confusion and conflict she felt mirrored in his features. I want to try, he finally said. I want to see if we can build something real between us, regardless of Charlotte, but with one condition. What? If she comes back to New York, if she finds out, if at any point this starts to hurt her. Matthew hesitated. We stop. Charlotte comes first. Helena felt as if she had received a gift and a sentence at the same time, the chance to be with Matthew, but always under the shadow of a sword of Damocles. And what if she never approves? What if she can never accept it? Then Matthew extended his hand over the table, covering hers. Then at least we will have tried, and we will have been honest about our feelings. Helena looked at the large, calloused hand covering hers, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. It was a risky proposal, laden with complications and potential future pain, but it was also a chance for true love, something she thought she would lose forever. All right, she said, intertwining her fingers with his. Let's try. Matthew smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the revelation in the park. But, Helena, he said, squeezing her hand, this time, no secrets, total honesty. Total honesty, she agreed, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Helena felt that maybe, just maybe, everything could turn out all right. The months of June and July passed in a golden haze of discoveries and caution. Helena and Matthew built their relationship like engineers build bridges, carefully, testing each beam, ensuring that the structure could support the weight of what they were creating. They saw each other. It was 2 times a week, always in discreet places, always aware that they were navigating unknown waters. It was a chilly Saturday morning, July 25th, when everything changed. Helen was in her apartment in Midtown, preparing morning coffee for Matthew, who had slept over for the second time. The intimacy was still new, delicate, laden with meaning that went beyond the physical. She wore a blue silk robe and hummed softly to a song she heard on the radio when Matthew's phone rang on the kitchen table. "Can you answer it?" he shouted from the bathroom. "It must be work." Helen glanced at the screen and felt her blood run cold. The name Charlotte glowed in white letters, accompanied by a photo of a smiling young woman she recognized instantly, even 15 years older. "Matthew!" Helen shouted, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. It's Charlotte." The sound of the shower stopped immediately, and seconds later, Matthew appeared in the kitchen with a towel wrapped around his waist, water dripping from his hair onto the ceramic floor. "Charlotte? Now?" He grabbed the phone, but the call had already dropped. "Strange. She never calls this early in Brazil. It's already noon in Portugal." Before he could say anything else, the phone rang again. This time Matthew answered immediately. "Carol." "Darling, how are you?" His voice automatically filled with the paternal affection that Helen had learned to admire, and she had to admit, envy a little. Helen could hear Charlotte's voice on the other end, deeper than she remembered, but with the same lively cadence of the girl she had known. Helen's heart raced so fast that she was sure Matthew could hear it. Calm down, Matthew said, his expression shifting from joy to concern. "Take a deep breath and tell me what happened." Helen leaned in, unable to help herself, trying to catch fragments of the conversation. She could hear scattered words. Fired, company closed, rent, I don't know what to do. Carol, listen, do you want to come back to Brazil? Matthew sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, running his free hand through his wet hair. No, no, darling, it's not a failure. Sometimes things just don't work out, and it's not our fault. Helen sat in the chair across from him, watching Matthew's expressions change as Charlotte spoke. Concern, tenderness, determination. It was clear he would do anything to help his daughter. "Of course you can stay here as long as you need," Matthew said. "No, it's not an inconvenience. This is your home, Charlotte. It always will be." Helen's stomach churned. Charlotte coming back to Brazil. Charlotte living in Matthew's house. All the careful balance they had built over the past months was about to crumble. "When do you get a flight?" Matthew was jotting down notes on a piece of paper. "Tuesday. Perfect. I'll pick you up at the airport. What time do you arrive?" Helen watched, fascinated and terrified, as Matthew automatically shifted back into protective dad mode. It was beautiful to see, but it also meant the end of the little universe they had created together. "Carol," Matthew said, his voice softening, "it's okay, darling. We'll figure everything out. You're not alone." The call ended, and they sat in silence in the sunny kitchen, the aroma of coffee mingling with the tension in the air. "She's coming back," Matthew finally said, as if he needed to verbalize the reality. "I heard." Helen tried to keep her voice neutral. "What happened?" "The translation company closed. Mass layoffs. And the apartment she shared with 2 friends. Well, without a job, she can't afford her share." Matthew looked at Helen, with an expression that mixed joy and panic. "She'll stay with me until she gets back on her feet." Helen nodded slowly, processing the implications. "For how long?" "I don't know. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months." Matthew stood up and began to pace the kitchen. "Helen, do you understand what this means for us? It means we can't see each other anymore." The words came out harsher than Helen intended. "At least not the way we've been." Matthew stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I can't bring you home with Charlotte there, and I can't keep going out every night without explanations." Helen felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. After months of building something beautiful and real with Matthew, Charlotte was coming back to destroy it all without even knowing she existed. "What if we told her," Helen suggested, knowing even before she finished the sentence that it was impossible. "Helen, she arrives in 4 days, emotionally fragile, after losing her job and having to come back to Brazil with her tail between her legs." Matthew shook his head. "I can't throw that in her face right now." "So what do we do?" Matthew sat back down, taking Helen's hands in his. "We wait. We let her stabilize, find a job, find a place to live. And then, when she's more emotionally stable, we talk to her. And during that time, Matthew hesitated. "Maybe it's better if we take a break." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. A break, as if we were teenagers who fought over something trivial. "Helen, it's not like that." "No, Matthew, it is exactly like that." Helen stood up abruptly, tightening the robe around her body. "We're letting Charlotte control our lives without her, even knowing we exist. She is my daughter, and I am, what? A convenient pastime that can be set aside when real life comes knocking? You know that's not true." Matthew stood up as well, trying to get closer, but Helen took a step back. "No, Matthew, I don't know, because every time Charlotte comes into the conversation, I become the secondary option." Helen felt the anger and frustration of months building up. First, it was the secrets we had to keep. Now it's the relationship we have to pause. When will I be a priority? Helen, you know, what's more ironic? Helen laughed without humor. I spent 15 years suffering because I lost Charlotte, and now I'm losing you because of her. She manages to destroy my relationships, even living 8,000 miles away. That's not Charlotte's fault. No, it's not. Helen stared directly at Matthew. It's our fault. Mine for always accepting to be second place, and yours for putting your adult daughter above your own right to be happy. The silence that followed was tense, like a taut string about to snap. Helen could see that her words had struck Matthew, but she was too tired to care. Helen, he finally said, I can't choose between you two. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to be honest with her, and with me. Helen crossed her arms. But you've already made your choice, haven't you? You chose the easier path. The easier path would be to end everything now and never speak to you again. Maybe you should do that then. Is that what you want? Helen looked at the man she had learned to love, standing in her kitchen with a towel, his hair still wet from the shower, his expression devastated. No, that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to fight for them. She wanted him to fight for them. But she was tired of being the only one willing to risk everything. What I want, Matthew, is a man who isn't afraid to own his feelings, who doesn't treat our relationship like something that needs to be hidden or paused. Helen took a deep breath. I've spent too much of my life waiting for Charlotte to come back. I won't spend the rest waiting for you to decide if I'm worth it. Matthew was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tired. What are you saying? I'm saying that when you decide what you really want, when you're ready to have an honest conversation with Charlotte about us, call me. Helen headed for the bedroom. Until then, I think it's best we don't see each other. Helen, please. She turned at the bedroom door. Matthew, I love you, but I can't continue in a relationship where I'm a shameful secret. You don't cause shame. Then prove it. Helen entered the bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it as she listened to Matthew's movements in the kitchen. A few minutes later, the front door closed softly. She slid down the door until she sat on the floor, finally allowing the tears to fall freely. In 4 days, Charlotte would be back in the US, and Helen was alone again, exactly where she had been 15 years before, but this time she wouldn't wait passively. If Matthew wanted to come back to her, he would have to make a real choice. And if he chose Charlotte above all, at least Helen would know where she stood. For the first time in months, Helen felt strangely at peace with the chaos of her life. 3 days later, Helen was at her clinic, trying to focus on a psychological report, when Maria appeared at the door with an expression she knew well, the same one her friend wore when she was about to interfere in someone's life for their own good. Helen, Maria said, closing the door behind her, you need to stop this self-sabotage. Helen didn't even look up from the computer. Good morning to you too, Maria. And I'm not sabotaging myself, I'm protecting myself. Protecting yourself from what? The possibility of being happy. Maria threw herself into the patient chair with typical theatricality. Honey, you broke up with Matthew just when he needs support the most. His daughter is coming back in crisis and you abandon him. I didn't abandon anyone. Helen finally stopped typing and looked at her friend. I just refused to keep being a dirty secret in his life. Helen, the situation is complicated. You can't expect him to resolve 15 years of history in a few months. I'm not expecting him to resolve anything. I'm waiting for him to be honest. With me and with Charlotte. Helen stood up and went to the window, watching the movement on Fifth Avenue. Maria, you didn't see his face when she called. It was as if I had ceased to exist instantly. Maria sighed. And if the situation were reversed, if you had an emotionally troubled daughter coming home, I would tell her the truth, because adults deal with truths, no matter how uncomfortable they may be, even if it could hurt her even more. Helen fell silent. It was a fair question, and the answer wasn't as simple as she would like to believe. "Maria," she finally said, "I spent 15 years wondering where Charlotte was, if she was okay, if she would ever come back. Now I find out she's coming back tomorrow, and I can't even be near Matthew because of the secrets we created." "Then stop creating secrets." "How?" "Go to the airport." Helen turned around so quickly she almost lost her balance. "Are you crazy?" "I'm lucid." "Helen, do you want honesty? Then be honest. Show up at the airport, see your daughter for the first time in 15 years, and force the situation to resolve." "Maria, I can't just show up at the airport. Can you imagine the shock it would be for Charlotte? Can you imagine the shock it will be when she finds out weeks or months later that you were secretly involved?" Maria leaned forward. "Helen, you have two options. Face this all at once, or live forever in the shadow of this situation." Helen returned to her chair, feeling like the world was spinning too fast. "And what if she rejects me? What if she gets so angry that she never wants to see either of us again? And what if she feels relieved? What if, deep down, she has also missed you? All these years?" Maria stood up and went to Helen. "Honey, you've spent 15 years creating terrible scenarios in your head. Your head. What if reality is better than you imagine? What if it's worse? Then at least you'll know, and you can truly move on." Helen was silent for a few minutes, processing her friend's crazy suggestion. Showing up at the airport would mean forcing a confrontation that could destroy any chance she had with Matthew or with Charlotte. But it would also mean stopping living like a ghost in her own life. "What time does her flight arrive?" Helen asked, almost whispering. "I don't know, but I bet you can find out." Helen picked up the phone, hesitated for a second, and then dialed Matthew's number. He answered on the second ring. "Helen? What time does Carol's flight arrive?" Silence on the other end of the line. "Helen, what are you thinking of doing?" "I'm thinking of stopping being a coward." "What time, Matthew?" "At 3:15 in the afternoon, Terminal 3 at JFK. But Helen, will you be there?" "Of course I'll be there. Then I'm going too." "Helen, no, not like this. Let me talk to her first. Explain the situation." "No, Matthew, no more explanations, no more preparations. If you want honesty, let's have honesty." Helen felt a determination she hadn't experienced in years. "See you there." She hung up before he could protest and looked at Maria, who was smiling like a cat that had just caught a mouse. "Ready to change your life?" Maria asked. "No," Helen replied, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. "But I'm going to do it anyway." JFK Airport at 3 in the afternoon was an organized chaos of people, luggage, and emotions. Helen stood near the international arrival gate, wearing dark jeans and a simple white blouse. She had chosen the most neutral outfit possible, as if that could minimize the impact of her presence. She saw Matthew before he saw her. He was leaning against a column, wearing jeans and a blue polo shirt, holding a small bouquet of yellow flowers. Sunflowers, Helen remembered, had always been Carol's favorite flowers. When he saw her, his expression went through various emotions: surprise, panic, resignation. "Helen," he said, approaching, "you really came. I warned you I would. I kind of hoped you'd change your mind on the way." "So did I." Helen looked at the flowers. Are sunflowers still her favorite? Matthew nodded, and for a moment the tension between them eased as they shared a memory about the same person they loved. "Matthew," Helen said, "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came because I can't hide who I am anymore." What if she can't handle it? What if it's too much for her right now? Then we'll figure out together how to help her. Helen took a deep breath. But at least we'll be honest. At that moment the gate opened, and the first passengers began to exit. Helen felt her heart race dangerously. In a few minutes she would see Carol for the first time in 15 years. "There," Matthew whispered, pointing discreetly. Helen looked in the indicated direction and felt as if the world had stopped. Carol was coming out of the gate, pulling a large suitcase and carrying a backpack on her shoulder. She was taller than Helen remembered, with light brown hair tied in a messy ponytail. She wore worn jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a leather jacket that suggested years of living in Europe. But it was her eyes that made Helen's heart almost stop. The same expressive green eyes, now on an adult woman's face, but still recognizable as those of the girl she had raised. Carol saw Matthew, and her face lit up with a smile that Helen recognized instantly. She started walking quickly toward them, then stopped abruptly when she realized there was someone else next to Matthew. Helen saw the exact moment Carol recognized her. The young woman's face went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and then something that seemed like a mix of anger and fear. "Helen." Carol's voice came out as an incredulous whisper. "Hi, Carol," Helen said, struggling to keep her voice steady. It's good to see you." Carol looked from Helen to Matthew and back to Helen, clearly trying to process the impossible situation she found herself in. "You two, you know each other?" Helen and Matthew exchanged a glance, and Helen knew this was the moment of truth. There would be no more turning back, no more excuses, no more time for preparations. "Carol," Helen said, stepping forward, "we need to talk." The silence in the car during the drive from JFK to the West Village was deafening. Carol sat in the back seat, her face turned toward the window, watching the urban landscape pass by as if it were the first time she had seen the city. Helen sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped in her lap to hide the trembling, while Matthew drove with visible tension in his shoulders. 40 minutes passed without a single word. When they finally arrived at Matthew's house, a 2-story townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, Carol was the first to break the silence. "Can someone explain to me what's going on here?" Her voice carried a coldness that Helen had never heard before. Matthew parked in the garage and turned off the engine. The mechanical sound was replaced by an even heavier silence. "Let's go inside," Matthew finally said. "We have a lot to talk about." Matthew's house was exactly as Helen had imagined, organized without being overly tidy, with functional furniture and some well-kept plants. The walls were decorated with photos of Carol at different ages and some simple artwork. Helen noticed a photo of her at 20, graduating from college, wearing the same determined expression she had always had. Carol sat on the brown leather sofa, still wearing her jacket as if she were ready to leave at any moment. Helen chose an armchair, leaving Matthew in the middle, both literally and figuratively. "So," said Carol, crossing her arms, "who's going to start?" Helen and Matthew exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them about who should take the initiative. "I'll start," said Helen, taking a deep breath. "Carol, Matthew and we met a few months ago. It was a casual encounter, a blind date set up by mutual friends." "A blind date?" Carol repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. "Are you two dating?" "We were," Matthew replied, "until we found out who Helen really was." "Who Helen really was?" Carol turned to look directly at him. "Matthew, I know exactly who Helen is. The question is, how did you two meet? New York has over 8 million residents." "It was a coincidence," Helen said. "I swear, Carol, when I saw Matthew on the first date, when I saw the necklace he was wearing..." Carol automatically looked at Matthew's chest, where the golden butterfly shimmered against his polo shirt. "You recognized the necklace," Carol said slowly, starting to piece things together. "It was impossible not to recognize. It was identical to the one I gave you when you were 12. Because it was the same." Carol pulled a thin chain from inside her jacket, revealing a golden butterfly identical to Matthew's. "I had a copy made to give to him on the 5-year anniversary of us living together." Helen felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The necklace was not just a symbol of the connection between her and Carol. It was a symbol of the family Carol had built away from her. "Carol," Matthew said softly, "you never told me you had another one, because I could never wear mine." Carol held the pendant between her fingers. "Every time I looked at it, I remembered." She looked directly at Helen. "I remembered things I wanted to forget." "What kind of things?" Helen asked, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. Carol laughed, but it wasn't a joyful sound. "Do you really want to know, Helen? Do you want to know why I left?" "I've always wanted to know." "Because you suffocated me." The words came out like a slap. "Because every time I tried to do something on my own, you showed up with a list of reasons why I shouldn't. Because you turned love into a prison." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. "I was trying to protect you." "From what?" "Life." Carol abruptly stood up and began to pace the room. "Helen, you took me to school, picked me up from school. You chose my clothes, my friends, my hobbies. When I tried to do theater in high school, you said I should focus on my studies. When I wanted to learn to drive at 17, you said New York was too dangerous. I wanted you to have the best opportunities. You wanted to keep me safe in a bubble." Carol turned to face her. "And when I turned 18 and said I wanted to live alone, you had a panic attack. You said I was ungrateful, that I didn't know what was good for me." Helen remembered that conversation perfectly. It had been one of the worst days of her life, seeing Carol, determined and unyielding, declaring that she needed space to grow. "I was scared," Helen admitted, "scared of losing you. And you ended up losing me anyway." Carol stopped walking and faced her. "Helen, do you know what the first thing I did when I left your house was?" Helen shook her head. "I went to the movies alone. A simple, silly thing that any teenager does. But for me, it was like breathing for the first time." Carol sat down again, but at the edge of the sofa. "And then I realized how many things I had never done because you were always afraid for me." "Carol," Matthew said gently, "Helen isn't the same person she was 15 years ago. How do you know?" Carol looked at him with an intensity Helen had never seen before. "Matthew, how long have you known her?" "A few months. And during those months, you both kept the fact that she is my adoptive mother a secret. Doesn't that remind you of anything?" Helen saw the blow hit Matthew hard. Carol was right. They had recreated exactly the pattern of behavior that had made her run away 15 years ago. "It wasn't like that," Helen began. "Wasn't it?" Carol stood up again. "You met, discovered the connection with me and decided to keep it a secret for months, while you built a relationship based on lies about who you really were." "We didn't lie about who we were," Matthew protested. "We lied about our connection to you." "It's the same thing," Carol exploded. "You both did exactly what Helen always did, decided what was best for me without asking me, decided that I couldn't handle the truth." Helen stood up too, feeling anger start to mix with guilt. "Carol, we were trying to protect you. You were happy in Europe, building your life. Why would we throw all of that away?" "Because I'm an adult," Carol shouted. "Because I have the right to know when the two most important people in my life are dating behind my back. We weren't doing anything behind your back." "Weren't you?" Carol laughed bitterly. "Helen, you both knew I would eventually come back to the US. You knew I would find out, and yet you continued this charade. Helen looked at Matthew, seeking support, but he seemed as lost as she was. Carol, he said, we didn't know how to handle the situation. It was unprecedented. It was. Carol nodded. Because you two are adults, mature people, who should have had the honesty to tell me from the beginning. She looked from one to the other. But instead, you recreated exactly the dynamic that made me run away 15 years ago. What do you mean? Helen asked, though she already knew the answer. I mean that you proved you haven't changed at all. Helen, you still think you know what is best for me. Better for me. And Matthew. She turned to him with a look of deep disappointment. Matthew, you let her convince you to keep secrets from me. That's not how it was. It was exactly like that. Carol grabbed her suitcase, which was still at the foot of the stairs. I need to get out of here. Carol, where are you going? Matthew stood up, clearly in a panic. I don't know. A hotel, a friend's house, anywhere I can think without you two telling me what's best for me. Please, said Helen, feeling as if she were reliving the nightmare from 15 years ago. Don't leave again. We can talk about this. We can work it out. Work it out? Carol turned at the door. Helen, you don't understand. It's not about you and Matthew being together. It's about you two treating me like a child who can't handle reality. Then give us a chance to do it differently, Matthew pleaded. Carol looked at him for a long moment, and Helen saw something break in the young woman's face. Matthew, you were the only person in the world I completely trusted, the only person who was always honest with me. Her voice was heavy with pain. And you chose her over that trust. Carol. No, she raised her hand. You both need to decide what you want, because you can't have a relationship based on lies and expect me to accept it. Carol opened the door and turned one last time. When you decide to be honest with me and with yourselves, maybe we can talk. Until then... She didn't finish the sentence. She simply left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Helen and Matthew alone in the devastating silence of their home. Helen sank into the armchair, feeling as if she had just lost Carol for the second time in her life, and this time she wasn't sure if there would be a third chance. 3 weeks passed since Carol had walked out of Matthew's house, and Helen felt as if she were living in a state of suspension. There was no news from Carol. She didn't answer Matthew's calls or respond to his messages. Through mutual friends, they learned that she was staying at Jessica's house, her best friend from college, in the West Village. It was a rainy August afternoon when Helen finally made a decision she had been postponing for weeks. She drove to the West Village, parked in front of the building where Carol was temporarily living, and called her daughter. Don't hang up, Helen said as soon as Carol answered. I'm downstairs. Can I come up? Silence on the other end of the line. Carol? Why are you here, Helen? Because I need to talk to you. Alone. Helen looked at the rain hitting the windshield. And because you were right about everything. Another long silence. Apartment 304, Carol finally said, and hung up. The building was old but well-maintained, with that understated elegance of 1950s architecture. Helen took the elevator up, her heart pounding as if she were about to face a life-or-death surgery. In a sense, that was exactly what it was. Carol opened the door, wearing grey sweatpants and an oversized white t-shirt. She looked thinner than Helen remembered, with dark circles under her eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. But she was still beautiful, still carrying that natural dignity that Helen had always admired. "Come in," Carol said, stepping aside from the door. The apartment was small but cozy, decorated with eclectic furniture and plants that made the space cheerful despite the rainy weather outside. Carol sat at the edge of the sofa, making it clear that this wouldn't be a long conversation. You said I was right, Carol said, getting straight to the point. About what? Helen sat in the opposite armchair, keeping the distance that Carol clearly needed. About everything. About how I raised you. About the secrets with Matthew. About how I never learned to treat you like an adult. Helen took a deep breath. And about how I lost you twice because of my own fears. Carol didn't respond, just waited for Helen to continue. Carol, I spent 15 years creating a romanticized version of how our relationship had been. I only remembered the good moments, the laughter, the trips, the Sunday mornings making pancakes. Helen felt tears beginning to form. I conveniently forgot how you always seemed frustrated when I cancelled your plans, or how your eyes would dim when I said you were too young for something. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve an honest mother. And because if there's still any chance for us to have some kind of relationship, it needs to be based on truth. Carol leaned back on the sofa, arms crossed. What kind of truth? The truth that I was an overprotective mother who turned love into control. The truth that when I got involved with Matthew, my first motivation was to hear from you. Helen forced herself to maintain eye contact. And the truth that I am completely in love with him, regardless of you. Helen, let me finish. Helen leaned forward. Carol, during these 3 weeks, Matthew and I talked a lot. About us, about you, about how we got into this situation, and we came to some conclusions. What conclusions? That we can't have a relationship based on secrets. Neither he and I, nor any of us with you. Helen took a deep breath. So we decided to tell everything, absolutely everything. Carol frowned. What do you mean by everything? How we met, how we discovered who you were, every conversation we had about you, every doubt, every fear. Helen stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain. And how we came to the conclusion that you are more important to both of us than our relationship. Did you break up? Not exactly. But we decided that if you can't accept our relationship, we will end it. Helen turned to face Carol. Because you were right. We can't build happiness on top of lies. Your pain. Carol remained silent for several minutes, processing Helen's words. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. What if I say I accept, but I'm still hurt? Then let's work on the hurt. Together, honestly. Helen returned to the armchair. Carol, I'm not asking for instant forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to do things differently. Do things differently how? By treating you like the intelligent adult woman you are, not making decisions for your own good without consulting you, not trying to protect you from information you have the right to know. Carol stood up and walked to the open kitchen, returning with 2 cups of tea. Helen recognized the brand. It was the same chamomile they used to drink together when Carol had a cold. Helen, said Carol, handing her a cup, do you know why I made up that story about Matthew? About the aunt who didn't want me? Helen shook her head. Because it was easier than explaining that I had a mother who loved me so much she almost smothered me with love. Carol sat down again. It was easier than admitting that I left, not because you were bad, but because I was suffocating. You didn't need to protect my feelings with Matthew. I wasn't protecting your feelings. I was protecting mine. Carol took a sip of her tea. Helen, do you want to know the truth about why I never reached out during those 15 years? I do. Because I was afraid you were right. That I really was too young, too inexperienced, unable to take care of myself. Carol looked directly at Helen. And I needed to prove to myself that I could live without you before I could choose to have you back in my life. Helen felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. And did. You prove it to yourself? Carol smiled for the first time since Helen arrived, a small but genuine smile. I did. I lived alone, worked, paid my bills, made my own mistakes, learned from them. She paused, and I discovered that I can be independent and still have a family. Is that what Matthew represents to you? Family? That's what you both represent to me, Carol corrected. If we can make this work. Helen felt a wave of hope. Are you willing to try? With conditions. What conditions? Carol leaned forward. First condition, no secrets. If you two are together, I want to know. If you're fighting, I want to know. If you're thinking about living together, getting married, having kids, anything, I want to know. Agreed. Second condition, I am not the mediator of your relationship. If you fight, you resolve it between yourselves. Don't come to me asking to pick sides or pass messages. Agreed. Third condition, I want family therapy. The three of us, to work through all this emotional mess we've created. Helen blinked, surprised. You want to do family therapy? I want us to learn how to be a functional family. And as dysfunctional as we are, we need professional help. And the fourth condition? There is no fourth condition for now. Carol smiled again. But I reserve the right to add more if you both revert to old patterns. Helen stood up and hesitantly extended her arms. Carol hesitated for a second before also standing up and accepting the hug. It was the first physical contact they had in 15 years, and Helen felt as if a wound she had carried for decades finally began to heal. I missed you so much, Helen whispered in Carol's ear. I missed you too, Carol whispered back. But now maybe we can do things differently. They pulled apart, and Carol wiped away a tear that had escaped. So, she said, returning to the sofa, tell me how you and Matthew fell in love. And this time, I want all the details. Helen laughed, a genuine laugh, relieved, full of possibilities. It's a long story. We have time, said Carol. Finally, we have all the time in the world. And for the first time in 15 years, Helen believed that was true.